Aristotle said that the function of tragedy was to provide a catharsis through pity and terror. There's no pity in Poe. There's only terror.
This man gets up, goes to the tomb of his dead wife, and removes her teeth.
The room is locked on the outside. The daughter's body is found stuffed up the chimney.
He puts her in the coffin, and then he screws the lid down. Now, you don't need to screw the lid down of a coffin. If the person's dead, they're not going to get out. You screw the lid down if you don't want them to get out.
Edgar Allan Poe lived during the first half of the 19th century. Remembered for his frightening tales and haunting poetry, he has left an indelible stamp on American literature. Yet his own short life was a tragedy, doomed perhaps from the start.
Funding for American Masters is provided by American Express, celebrating the world of creativity through American Masters. The National Endowment for the Arts. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting. By annual financial support from viewers like you, and by the following. Major funding for this special presentation on Edgar Allan Poe was provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Additional funding was provided by the Maryland Humanities Council and by the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities and Public Policy.
Many people told me that Poe was the first serious writer they've read. They said that's the first time they read something and they knew it was literature. Isn't that interesting that it turns out to be Poe? Because they're stories, and they're kind of ghost stories, and it's the kind of thing you might read as a kid, and then before you know it, it's maybe a little bit more than what it appears to be.
Some people have been deceived, I think, into regarding Poe as superficial because there is so much violence, ugliness, decay, and decomposition on the surface of Poe's work. Some people have satisfied themselves by saying simply that Poe was a necrophiliac.
I think we often dismiss Poe on the grounds that he writes the sensational story, and that's what's in him. In point of fact, Poe is almost always, I think, writing for multiple audiences. One of these audiences wants the sensational story. He gives it to them. But Poe is also writing for another audience. It's the audience of the psyche.
True. Nervous. Very, very dreadfully nervous. I had been and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story.
The Telltale Heart could have been written in a sense in the year 1200, but it could be written in the year 1500, the year 2005. There isn't anything that dates it. That's what makes it, I think, so wonderful.
It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain. But once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object there was none. Passion there was none. I loved the old man. He had never harmed me. He had never given me insult. For his gold, I had no desire. I think it was his eye. One of his eyes resembled that of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold. And so, by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man and thus rid myself of the eye forever.
Poe thought more deeply about the craft of fiction and poetry, I think, than any other writer in America at the time. And at his best, really worked at his writing very, very hard. He also cranked out a lot of journalistic junk, but when he wanted to think seriously and had the time to work carefully on his work, he turned out very, very polished fiction.
You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing. But you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded. With what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him.
He had this art of leaving things out. It's like the silence that's useful in certain kinds of music. And a typical story by Henry James puts everything in. So you have long, almost opaque paragraphs where characters are barely moving and can barely walk over to the window. But by that time in Poe, the man is already killed and dismembered, the old man. It happens very swiftly, I think, in about 4 pages.
There's certainly a strong theatrical element in all his stories, and I find it very hard to lose sight of the fact that both his parents were actors and that he was orphaned at an early age.
His mother was a very promising actress and one of the most talented young actresses on the American stage, including at the time that she died. I would think that it was certainly the main event of his life in many different ways. For one thing, there's good evidence to think that Poe was present at her death. The day or so before Eliza Poe died in Richmond, advertisements described her surrounded by her 3 children and helpless. If he was, it would seem to explain a lot of things in his later fiction. I mean, children don't very well know how to understand a parent's death. Most aren't really able to mourn, and most children go on believing that the parent in some way isn't really dead. All of Poe's work is some sort of effort to imagine how dying may be impossible, or to understand how somebody may die and still come back.
He may always be writing about that tragedy, but he's always writing in fresh, different ways so that we apprehend it anew. I mean, he never really writes about scenes that he experienced. They're all transmogrified into this Gothic wonderland.
To be buried while alive is beyond question the most terrific of the extremes which has ever fallen to the lot of mere mortality. The rigid embrace of the narrow house, the blackness of the absolute night, the silence like a sea that overwhelms, the unseen but palpable presence of the conqueror worm. We can dream of nothing half so hideous in the realms of the nethermost hell. The premature burial.
A lot of the time in his fiction, Poe was working with the conventions of Gothic fiction, that kind of other occult world that lies just behind ordinary reality and once in a while intrudes itself. Poe took those conventions of Gothic and invested it with his own sort of profound sense of the uncanny. I mean, his sense really, which children have, that inanimate objects can move, that there are menacing things in the dark, that the dead can return. It's that conflict, I think, that characterizes most of Poe's fiction and poetry. People are alive and dead at the same time. There's an acknowledgement of the reality of death and then at the same time some sort of denial of it. But nothing in Poe stays buried. That always fascinates me.
Orphaned at age 3, Edgar was taken in by Richmond theater patron Frances Allen and her husband John, one of the wealthiest men in Virginia. Born in Boston in 1809, Edgar would grow up on the banks of the James River. He had an early gift for language and wrote poetry of his own, but increasingly withdrew from the family, much to the annoyance of John Allan.
Edgar does nothing and seems quite miserable, sulky and ill-tempered to all the family. The boy possesses not a particle of gratitude for all my care and kindness towards him.
Poe's relationship with John Allan worsened when he went to college. Edgar battled his tight-fisted guardian over money, and in trying to pay for his books and lodging, racked up a gambling debt of $2,000. When John Allan refused to pay for a second term, Poe left the only home he had ever known.
My determination is to leave your house and endeavor to find some place in this wide world where I will be treated not as you have treated me. I have heard you say that you had no affection for me.
I think it's very important that Poe never took the Allan name. We think of him always as Edgar Allan Poe, but he always signed his work Edgar A. Poe. He never really felt entitled to that middle name of Allan, and in fact, John Allan never gave it to him. The Allans never formally adopted Poe. He was there as an act of charity, and he never really forgot that.
Disdaining Poe's literary aspirations, John Allan refused to support him financially. Penniless, Poe set out to be a writer.
Poe's initial ambition, I think pretty clearly, was to become a great poet, and that didn't necessarily mean even becoming a professional one. And he wrote lots of poetry, of which easily the most famous is The Raven, and the most successful. Poe wrote The Raven in 1845, published early in that year, a smash hit. Everybody loved it. Women especially were terribly fond of it. And Poe actually developed in the New York area during 1845 and 1846 a sort of set of literary groupies who were New York society women who came to meet the Raven himself. They came to identify Poe with this poem, and he would dutifully recite the poem on demand.
Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as if someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. Only this and nothing more. Ah, distinctly, I remember. It was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow. Vainly had I sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow. Sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels named Lenore, nameless here forevermore.
The Raven was written towards the end of Poe's career and brought him fame, but very little income. Most of his money would come from his prose. In the 1830s, when Poe began to write, the golden age of periodicals was dawning. Literature was becoming brief, condensed, easily circulated. The whole tendency of the age, he wrote, is magazine-wood.
In the 1820s, a typical new printing press had not changed in any profound way from the principles Gutenberg discovered back in the 15th century. Gutenberg could have spent a couple of days in a print shop in the 1820s, and he would have known exactly how to work the machine. By the 1840s, you had power presses replacing hand presses. These new power presses were able to vastly increase the amount of printed material that was produced.
Edgar Poe was the only writer of his generation to try to make a living strictly by his pen. He began to write professionally in Baltimore, but soon headed north to Philadelphia, then New York, the cities that were home to America's new publishing industry.
Perhaps the most important decision, professionally speaking, that Poe ever made was to become a professional magazinist, by which I mean that he became not just a magazine writer, but also a magazine editor.
In the editorial offices of the nation's new magazines, Poe found a trade and the hope of steady employment. He was an excellent editor, one who energetically sought contributions from the best writers in the country.
Dear Mr. Irving, it would be desirable that you agree to furnish one paper each
Dear
month.
Miss Sigourney, is it not possible that we can make an arrangement with yourself for an article each month? It would give us the greatest pleasure to do so, and the terms of Mr.
Dear Mr.
Graham
Longfellow, Mr. George Graham desires me to beg of you the honor of your contribution to its pages.
Geared to a largely female readership, the country's new magazines offered romance tales, popular tunes, and the latest in fashion. Poe mocked these publications as namby-pamby. He wanted to improve the content of the nation's magazines, to develop this singular new feature, the short story, into an art form.
If I fully succeed in my purposes, I will not fail to produce some lasting effect upon the growing literature of the country, while I establish for myself a name which that country will not willingly let die.
Poe worked as an editor for 4 separate magazines, but employment was hardly constant. His longest stay at any one magazine was 16 months, often at odds with his employers over alcohol or his sometimes prickly personality. He would become restless and move on. But in his time, he became nationally respected as someone who demanded the highest literary standards.
An interesting facet of Poe's career, and one that most of us today find surprising, is that he would not have been known to his public primarily as a writer of short stories. He would have been known primarily as a critic, as the man who wielded the literary tomahawk.
Wakanda, from beginning to end, is trash. It has no merit whatsoever.
He was very savage in reviewing many other works written by Americans who had great reputations, and he put them down in no uncertain terms.
It is universally admitted that the poetical claims of Mr. Longfellow have been vastly overrated, and that the individual himself would be esteemed little without the accessories of wealth and position.
He expended himself in the fighting of battles that were really beneath him, too trivial. He was reviewing completely forgotten books, ephemeral books. They were probably forgotten a year later, except by the writers.
At times he undertook not only to criticize the writer's work, but also the writer's appearance, the way the writer combed her hair, I mean, whether it's too short, too fat, and Poe made a lot of enemies. A lot of people detested Poe.
He was a classic outsider, a guy who didn't fit in, a guy who couldn't get it together. His life seems to have been something of a mess. He was a drifter, too, you know, from city to city, couldn't seem to settle down. When he settles down with his 13-year-old cousin, who he marries. But still, there's no state in the union that would be legal in today. And yet it must have been a very close and somewhat touching. She dies 15, 16 years later, and he doesn't survive her by very long. He seems to have died of a broken heart, I mean, which is a very Poe-like thing to die of.
When they were married, Poe, in fact, called her Sissy, sister, and she was to him a kind of sister or a playmate. He not only really married his first cousin, Virginia, I mean, he took into his family also her mother, Muddy, whom he referred to always as his mother. Virginia, she was plump and very cherubic looking, even though she was very young when Poe married her, only 13. She looked even younger and stayed very, very young looking throughout her life. So Poe had constantly the experience, really, of having married a child.
I, Edgar, do take thee, Virginia, to be my married wife, and do, in the presence of God,
Poe made it his duty, really, to care for them, and they felt very cared for by him. I mean, part of Poe's money problems and money worries wasn't only earn enough, but to take care of them. And he managed to provide Sissy with piano lessons and put food on the table. At the same time, Muddy and Sissy made him the object of a kind of totally exclusive attention. I mean, there really was no one in their lives but Poe. The three lived together like a tight little island, sort of orphans in the storm, three desperate people sort of stumbling through existence.
He was completely penniless. He also was, needless to say, the most unthrifty person that ever lived. His sense of reality was always slightly off balance. And the fact is also, there was something about Poe that made it easy for people to cheat him. The editors who cheated him, who paid him these unbelievably grotesque prices for his stories, $5, $10, $15, knew that he was in some way a sucker because he depended upon them so much, and because he loved to write.
I am excessively slothful and wonderfully industrious by fits. I have thus rambled and dreamed away whole months, and awake at last to a sort of mania for composition. Then I scribble all day and read all night, so long as the disease endures.
For most of his career, Poe was a freelance writer, submitting his stories to a wide array of magazines. Every year saw the publication of one new tale, and sometimes several. Many people who met him were struck by his imaginative nature.
I remember being particularly impressed by the power that he seemed to possess of identifying himself with whatever he was describing. He related to me all the facts of a voyage to the moon, which he proposed to put on paper, with a truthfulness which impressed you with the idea almost that he himself had just returned from the journey, which existed only in his imagination.
We know when we pick up a Poe story that he is out to tell us a story and to thrill us and chill us and entertain us and not necessarily uplift us morally.
The cat followed me down the steep stairs and, nearly throwing me headlong, exasperated me to madness. Uplifting an axe, I aimed a blow at the animal, but this blow was arrested by the hand of my wife. Goaded by the interference into a rage more than demoniacal, I withdrew my arm from her grasp and buried the axe in her brain.
He wanted to affect his audience, and the bottom line of that is he wanted people to buy his work. He wanted to be a successful magazine editor and writer. He wanted an audience. He had a relationship with an audience much more like an entertainer.
A lot of the things he wrote about were very real fears for everyone in those days. Being buried alive was a common fear because it did happen to people. They didn't check as carefully as we do today.
With his tales of terror, Poe set a foundation for the modern short story, crafting his narratives to a preconceived effect, using the techniques of poetry to heighten the tension in his fiction, making his tales among the best known in world literature.
A large part of it is really staying on the track and not getting off on tangents and really achieving that unity of effect and knowing what's essential and what isn't, and paring down.
What I then saw confounded and amazed me. The sweep of the pendulum had increased in extent by nearly a yard. As a natural consequence, its velocity was also much greater. But what mainly disturbed me was the idea that it had perceptibly descended. The pit and the pendulum.
His appeal today, I think, really derives mostly from the emotional intensity of everything he did. There's a feeling in almost all his stories of an intense dream that he's recounting.
A lot of things for Poe happen in moonlight. All the interesting things happen at night. And they talk about doing things in the morning, but the morning never seems to come.
So with Poe, it can be read just on a level of plot. These bizarre things that happen, and they're amazing and supposed to evoke terror. At the point where I read him now, I'm interested in the formal properties, the way he uses language, the way he piles these adjectives. And he talks about states of mind, basically. The Fall of the House of Usher, if I remember the beginning, he's riding under this oppressive sky, and everything has to do with the state of mind of the narrator.
During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone on horseback through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself, as the shades of the evening drew on, within view of the melancholy House of Usher.
Composer Philip Glass has set two of Poe's tales to music. In 1988, he premiered his opera based on Poe's famous story, The Fall of the House of Usher.
The best collaborators are, when they work together, give a lot of room to each other. And Poe gives you a lot of room to work with. Usher has been made into plays and movies and operas. Mine is not the first nor last opera on Usher. Part of the content of these works is not in the work itself, but in the person who reads the work. In other words, you complete the story. You supply all the details.
In The Fall of the House of Usher, as in most of his tales of horror, Poe used the conventions in Gothic fiction which emphasized the grotesque, the outlandish, and the bizarre.
You come to the place where he screws the lid down of the coffin. That's a big sign that something funny was going on. Why did he screw the lid down? Basically, he was burying his sister alive, and he knew it. And she comes back, and she knows that he was doing it. And the reason she murders him, if it were, why would she murder him? She said, oh, it's just a mistake, I'm sorry. I thought you were dead. I'm glad you're back. It could have been like that, but it wasn't. She comes back, and she knew that he was murdering her, that she knew that he had attempted to murder her, and her revenge is to murder him. And then the house comes down on both of them. Well, it's all crazy, but it makes sense.
He makes it hard not to believe him. He'll say, I'm going to tell you a story. You can't possibly believe this. You're going to think I'm mad, but I'm going to tell you anyway. So you're predisposed to believe him. He's very clever at disarming the reader in various ways.
Normally, when one reads a work of fiction, you expect it to involve people, and as all works of fiction seem to do, and therefore a real world. And you move into a Poe story, and that doesn't seem to hold up very well.
The characters in his fiction aren't characters at all. They aren't the kind of people who eat breakfast, for example. They aren't the kind of people who get dressed and own houses and that sort of thing. Not in the ordinary sense, at any rate. The reality they have is that they are parts of an enveloping consciousness or soul.
I would think that Freud would have had a field day with Poe.
I think that Poe resists a particular psychological analysis. I don't think it's about that. I think it's about emotions that are freed from a situation, from context, and from character. That's, I think, what makes it so, sometimes so bizarre and so appealing.
The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as best I could. But when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge. You who so well know the nature of my soul will not suppose, however, that I gave utterance to a threat. At length I would be avenged. This was a point definitely settled. But the very definitiveness with which it was resolved precluded the idea of risk. I must not only punish, but punish with impunity. Neither by word nor deed had I given Fortunato cause to doubt my goodwill. I continued, as was my wont, to smile in his face, and he did not perceive that my smile now was at the thought of his immolation. He had a weak point, this Fortunato, although in other regards he was a man to be respected, even feared. He prided himself on his connoisseurship in wine.
My dear Fortunato, you are luckily met. How remarkably well you look tonight. But I have received a cask of what passes for Amontillado. I have my doubts.
So, Amontillado, a cask, impossible, and in the middle of carnival.
I have my doubts. Well, I was silly enough to pay the full Amontillado price without consulting you in the matter. You were not to be found, and I was fearful of losing a bargain.
Amontillado.
I have my doubts.
Amontillado.
And I must satisfy it.
Amontillado.
As you are engaged, I am on my way to Lucchesi. If anyone has a critical turn, it is he. He will tell me.
Lucchesi cannot tell Amontillado from sherry.
And yet some fools will have it that his taste is a match for your own.
Come, let us go.
Whither?
To your vaults.
No, my friend, I will not impose upon your good nature. I perceive you have an engagement.
I have no engagement. Come.
No, my friend. It is not the engagement, but the severe cold with which I perceive you are afflicted. The vaults are insufferably damp. They are encrusted with nitre.
But let us go. Nevertheless, the cold is merely nothing. Amontillado. You have been imposed upon. And as for Lucchesi, he cannot distinguish sherry from Amontillado.
Now, what Poe does is something which is absolutely magical, which is the transference of the writer's mind to the reader's mind and expecting how the reader will react. He starts from the fact that fear has an obvious picture of itself, and the panic is always of the same kind. Consequently, those fearful details in the pit and the pendulum and the black cat or the cask of Amontillado, all these things come from applying materially specific details of what goes on in psychological states.
How long have you had that cough?
It's nothing.
Come. We shall go back. Your health is precious. You are rich, respected, admired, beloved. You are happy, as I once was. You are a man to be missed. It is no matter to me. Come. You will be ill, and I cannot be responsible. Besides, there is Lucchesi.
Enough. The cough is merely nothing. It will not kill me. I shall not die of a cough.
True. And indeed, I had no intention of alarming you unnecessarily, but you should use all proper caution. The draft of this Medoc will defend us from the dance. Drink.
I drink to the buried that repose around us.
And I, to your long life.
The soul becomes intoxicating. And God knows the word intoxication was a very important thing in Poe's life, since he believed in intoxication, quite apart from being the first of the many violent drunks who have made so much of liquor in the history of American literature.
Poe did not drink well. One of his friends at UVA spoke of his taking a glass of whiskey and simply bolting it down, and that was it for him.
Let us go on. But first, another draft of the Medoc.
Finally, it has to be said that Poe did not need liquor in order to have those fantastic flights of the imagination which make his stories like no one else's.
You do not comprehend.
Not I.
Then you are not of the Brotherhood.
How?
You are not of the Masons.
Yes, 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 yes.
You. Impossible.
Yes.
A Mason?
Yes.
A sign.
It is this.
You jest. But let us proceed to the Amontillado.
Be it so.
Proceed. The Amontillado is within.
That's for Lucchesi, huh?
He is an ignoramus.
Pass your hand over the wall. You cannot help feeling the nitre. It is indeed very damp. Once more, let me implore you to return. No? Then I must positively leave you. I must first render you all the little attentions in my power.
The Amontillado. True. The Amontillado.
There's no getting away from the fact. Everybody, whether he, she recognizes it or not, is afraid of only one thing in the world, which is obliteration, because it's the one thing in the world which we know nothing about. And Poe, who had all these fears about being buried alive and the rest of it, he was always working on the ultimate fear, the ultimate panic.
when you're scared of something, it isn't that it's there and that's awful. It's that you're not sure that it's there, although awful it is. But your mind doesn't want to believe, and yet it has to believe. The evidence, look at it. And it's as if the mind then were a kind of diaphragm, back and forth. Yes, no, yes, no, yes, no.
A very good joke indeed. An excellent jest. We will have many a rich laugh about it at the palazzo. Over our wine.
Yes, yes. The Amontillado.
Yes. The Amontillado. But is it not getting late? Will there not be awaiting us at the palazzo, the Lady Fortunato and the rest? Let us be gone.
Yes, let us be gone.
For the love of God, Montresor!
Yes, for the love of God.
Fortunato! Fortunato!
It's very important, always in talking about Poe, thinking about Poe, to recognize that he's working on you all the time. He is a terrorist of the imagination.
For half a century, no mortal has disturbed the bones. In pace, requiescat.
I think what Poe would like readers to have taken away from his work was a feeling of its versatility more than anything else. His ability to make you laugh, scare you, and do anything he really wanted at his will.
Poe produced in his short life more than 70 stories, hundreds of articles and book reviews, a novella, 4 volumes of poetry, a philosophical treatise, and part of a play. His prodigious output included even a new literary genre, the detective tale. He had invented one of the most popular forms of fiction ever devised. His memorable hero, the detective C. Auguste Dupin, applied his critical skills to unsolvable mysteries and set the standard for the great crime solvers who followed.
The Sherlock Holmes stories are very much patterned after the Dupin stories. In fact, when Holmes meets Watson, one of the first things Watson says to him when Holmes starts showing off his mental capacities is, "You remind me of Edgar Allan Poe's Dupin."
The country where Poe set his detective stories was also the country where he found the greatest fame. In France, Poe was celebrated by the great poet and critic Charles Baudelaire, who translated Poe's tales, essays, and poetry into French.
Poe was so loved in Paris. Of course, his works are in matching leather editions, and you find them in expensive bookstores. In fact, he's so loved by the French that there was even a theory that he was really French and somehow had gone to Baltimore, and I don't know why they figured out he had written in English, but this actually was a story I'd heard. He said, "Oh, well, he's really a French writer."
In large measure, Poe is alive because of Baudelaire. The French have provided the great Poe critics over all of the intervening years. On the other hand, Baudelaire is also responsible for our most significant misreading of Poe, the man. For Baudelaire was convinced that every character in Poe fiction was a part of Poe. Nothing could be, I think, more misleading than the notion that the largely insane, often homicidally insane narrators of Poe's stories bear any resemblance whatever to Edgar Allan Poe, who was a good husband, a loyal friend, a hard worker, a nice guy. We would like Edgar Poe if we had a chance to meet him, I'm convinced.
Poe could be very charming. I mean, Poe was a great favorite in the New York literary salons. He was, after all, a Southerner. He grew up in Richmond, and he got hold of some of the Southern courtesy and Southern gentlemanliness. And when he wanted to, he could really get himself together. But, you know, the same things that creep out of the tombs constantly in Poe, in his fiction, crept back out of him, too, and finally couldn't manage it.
My dear little wife has been dangerously ill. About a fortnight since, in singing, she ruptured a blood vessel, and it was only on yesterday that the physicians gave me any hope of her recovery. You might imagine the agony I have suffered, for you know how devotedly I love her.
Virginia's death really destabilized Poe altogether. He had always been a drinker, I mean, but after Virginia started coughing up blood, his drinking became really serious. As long as he had the anchor of Sissy and Muddy, he was all right. Once he lost that, then he was lost.
It was many and many a year ago, in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And this maiden, she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. She was a child, and I was a child in this kingdom by the sea. But we loved with a love that was more than love, I and my Annabel Lee.
After her death, and very painful death, Poe went altogether haywire. I mean, there were reports in the New York City newspapers that Poe had gone insane. At the least, his behavior was very difficult. He was alienating a lot of people, making a lot of enemies, writing some strange works.
Poe had earned only $6,200 in his 18 years of writing. Now destitute, he relentlessly sought the affection of 4 prosperous society women.
What they all shared was a sort of inaccessibility for one reason or another. None was really a suitable mate, and, you know, that may have been part of the attraction of them, really, for Poe, who wanted to get married and also didn't want to get married, which is really true about his romantic attachments all through his life. I mean, there certainly is some kind of fear of adult, you know, adult relationships in Poe and sex.
In 1849, his life unwinding, Poe traveled from New York to Philadelphia and then further south, delivering lectures on composition and readings of The Raven to raise money for a literary magazine of his own. "If I succeed," Poe wrote, "I put myself within 2 years in possession of a fortune and infinitely more." His journey ended in Richmond. In the late summer, Poe decided to return to New York to bring Muddy Clem, his mother-in-law, back to Richmond. Despite a high fever and cautions from a doctor, he boarded a ship and traveled north.
For the next several days, we really don't know what happened to Poe at all. He turns up next in the records in Baltimore and sitting in a bar, semi-conscious, dingy clothes, a battered hat, sort of dirty, and is taken to a hospital. From accounts that are available through the attending physician, he became apparently delusional, talking to objects on the wall, lasted only a few days and then died. The cause of his death has been variously given, ranging from a severe case of alcoholism just some kind of infectious fever to brain fever, something like that. But in any case, he was dead then by the age of 40.
Thank heaven, the crisis, the danger is past, and the lingering illness is over at last, and the fever called living is conquered at last. The sickness, the nausea, the pitiless pain have ceased with the fever that maddened my brain, with the fever called living that burned in my brain.
This death was almost a suicide prepared for a long time. You will not be surprised that for such a man life should have become hell and that he should have come to a bad end. You will be astonished that he was able to endure such a long time. Charles Baudelaire.
The death of Mr. Poe will startle many, but few will be grieved by it. The poet was well known personally or by reputation in all this country. He had readers in England and in several of the states of continental Europe, but he had few or no friends. Rufus Griswold.
Of course, most famously after Poe's death, Griswold wrote a very slanderous memoir of Poe that later became the basis of a lot of Poe biographies. I mean, as if Poe's life weren't seamy enough, Griswold invented stories like Poe went up and down the street flailing his arms, cursing at the skies. He apparently spread by word of mouth a story that Poe and his mother-in-law were lovers. And, you know, many later biographies of Poe were built on Griswold's slanders.
Griswold successfully managed to do real damage to Poe's reputation in America. He did not assess Edgar Allan Poe as a writer who made an art form of the short story, invented the tale of detection, wrote haunting poetry, was a brilliant literary critic. Instead, he denounced Poe as a lying, half-mad alcoholic, gifted with a genius that he squandered.
I think that the story is really not a story of weaknesses so much as it's a story of pluck and hard trying.
He also fits almost that image of the artist in the way that Van Gogh did. You know, the guy that just couldn't get it together. And I think we all have a certain sympathy for that person. I think we're all a little bit like that person. And then when they turn out to be a genius, then it turns out to be, well, of course, that makes it understandable, you know.
From childhood's hour, I have not been as others were. I have not seen as others saw. I could not bring my passions from a common spring. From the same source I have not taken my sorrow. I could not awaken my heart to joy at the same tone. And all I've loved alone.
Every good writer's ahead of his time. What really counts with literature is not whether a man is of a time or not. What really counts is if he can be read and reread and reread long after his death. And that is certainly true about Poe. I mean, he's magnificent that way because he's always there. You simply can't get away from him. And even when he bothers you and you have all sorts of things to say about his personal life and this and that, and the incredible tragedy of his life, which was really quite pitiful, the stories are there, and they're always there.